Welcome into the Men Are Forged podcast. I'm your host, Cartwright Morris. The Men Are Forged platform and each episode on this podcast is for the forging of men into great leaders. We are all about men stepping into their God-given leadership abilities and calling, whether that's work, life, or relationships. So if you enjoy this podcast, please like, follow, or subscribe. You can go to menarforged.com to find out if you're a good fit for my Leaders Collective, a group of leaders growing together. So go to menarforged.com. Today's episode is with Chase Replogle. Chase is the author of the 5 Masculine Instincts. This book is life-changing. He is an author, a podcaster. You can check out his podcast, the Pastor Writer Podcast. Chase is, he comes from Missouri. He's a pastor, and he's just got his own unique story from pastoring, from leading men, and his own story of really unpacking, what is that motivates us as men? They're amoral. They're not good or bad, but there's certain things that if we pursue too hard, it can lead to destructive tendencies. And so we kind of unpack that in the podcast as well in this book. And you can buy that book at menarforged.com/authors, as well as just going to themasculineinstincts.com for more. But today, here is my interview with Chase Replogle. All right, well, welcome into the Men Are Forged podcast. I got a great guest today. He's the author of the 5 Masculine Instincts, Chase Replogle. I think I got it right that time. So nailed it. As many of my listeners know, I'm still working on my, phonetic skills day after day, right? So, but I have read a good portion of your book, Chase, and I freaking love it. And I recommend any men out there just to dive into this book. Go to the 5masculineinstincts.com, take the free Masculine Instincts personality test, because I took it and I was like, this is really interesting. And then I read the book. I'm like, oh yeah, that's me for sure. So just want to give that plug for you, Chase. But Chase, thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm honored to do it. So thanks for having me on, and thanks for taking time to read the book and take the assessment. And I'm excited to hear that it went well, that it was helpful for you.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into the book and just hear your process. Before we do, I know it's summertime, and here in Alabama, it's kind of sometimes it's so hot that you can't really get outside. I don't know what it's like in Missouri, but I know you're a sailing enthusiast. Is the summertime, is that the sailing season for Missouri?
It is, although it has been brutally hot here this summer. So we've had a stretch, we're in a stretch of like right at 100-degree days, which normally we get a few of those this summer, but we've had like 2 weeks of them. So we've got there's a lake about an hour north of where I live, and it's kind of a best kept secret for the Midwest. It's just a great sailing lake. People come from all over to sail it. And so my wife and I have nothing fancy, a 25-foot Catalina up there on a slip. And so it's an old boat, older than I am, but I like tinkering with it and working on it. And then we try a couple weekends out of the month to get up there and sail, and planning on going this Saturday. So we'll battle the heat and maybe get in the water some and enjoy it.
That's great. I imagine that's just a unique experience versus I grew up going on a pontoon boat, which is fun, right? But
my parents have one of those, so I know all about the pontoon life, which is fun. So yeah.
Which you saw, I imagine July 4th, were you out on the sailboat watching fireworks?
Yeah, so I live really close to, people are familiar with like Branson, Missouri. The Table Rock Lake is down there, and so they've got a great fireworks show. And so we pulled the pontoon out, us and several hundred other boats, and threw an anchor out on one of the points. And it was fun to sit with your feet in the water and watch the fireworks over the bridge. It was a fun night.
That's great. Okay, so you weren't on the sailboat, because I imagine that might have been a little difficult to watch fireworks and sail and all that.
Yeah, you can throw the anchor and set. We could make it happen, but the pontoon's a little easier to navigate all the traffic for sure.
That makes sense. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like fireworks on the lake, it's like a massive traffic jam. If anybody hasn't seen that, it's insane. But first, Chase, I would love just to, first off, did you grow up in Missouri? What about your upbringing? Did you grow up in a Christian family? What first exposed you to the Bible and Christianity?
Yeah, so I did. I grew up great parents. My parents got saved sort of in their late 20s, and so we grew up in a good church, and both my parents believers. My dad was a cop for 35 years, a state trooper here in Missouri, and so had a great upbringing. Grew up in Jefferson City, the capital, so not far from where I live now. But with him being a state trooper, we moved around the state of Missouri quite a bit, but always kind of in this general area. And so I came to faith early. I had a great church that was teaching me the Word of God and a family raising me in it. But honestly, it was probably in college that faith really became personal to me. I sometimes will describe it as there are these moments in history of awakenings, and I think that's what it was for me. I was certainly a believer and believed it, but something about it became very true to me, very real to me in my college years. And so that became kind of an inflection point for, I think, that faith becoming my own and really wanting to dig in and understand it for myself as well.
Yeah. And was writing a part of that? Because I could see you definitely take an academic approach. Like I was, you quote J.K. Chesterton, you quote Leo Tolstoy. I mean, that quote in the ambition chapter of Leo Tolstoy, like I've told clients, I've written it down. I mean, it's like, I needed to hear that. So yeah, I mean, from writing and the academic standpoint, what kind of really got you into that?
So I came kind of late to writing through reading. So books were really important to me, particularly, honestly, a part of that kind of awakening to faith experience was discovering books that were meaningful. That seems a little strange, but I didn't grow up reading a lot. I thought of books as something that were didn't really apply. They were something just strictly academic. You studied in an English class. And then in college, I started realizing there were these authors, both current but also historical, who were writing about the things of faith that I was wrestling with or thinking about. And so those, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, I read his Life Together and Cost of Discipleship in college, and just were really transformative experiences. And so that reading became more and more important to me, both personally, but also in my faith. And I think anybody who's really loves books, at some point you get around to wondering if you could do it too, right? You love books and you wonder, could I write one of these things that I love so much? And so for me, writing really flowed out of reading. It was something I did kind of quietly in the margins for a lot of years. I manuscript my sermons when I preach on Sundays, so I'm usually writing those out word for word. Usually there's about 3,000 words in a sermon, something like that on Sundays. So, every week I was in this discipline. I preach, 48 times a year. So I was in this discipline every week of just writing and really coming to enjoy that and love that process. And so eventually said, okay, I think I'm going to try to work on a book flowing out of that writing I've been doing kind of quietly and privately these years. And that was really sort of the beginning point for what eventually became the 5 Masculine Instincts.
Yeah. Oh, so you're one of those who writes everything down. I had a boss who, he's similar. Every talk he gave, he wrote every word out. And then people would wonder why he had a book out every year pretty much. And it's like, well, he just takes his talks and puts them in a book. So it's like, you're one of those people.
What happened with me is I would get up there to speak and I would say something, and then I wouldn't be confident enough that I had said it right, that people understood. And so I'd say it another way, and then I wouldn't get a reaction. So I'd say it a third way, and I'd feel myself just sort of spinning my wheels up there. And so for me, writing was, I get to sort of hit pause on that insecurity of being in front of people, and I get to decide, how do I really want to say something? And then I get the confidence in front of people of knowing this is the best I have to offer. Maybe it doesn't always work, but it's at least the best I have for how I want to communicate this and say this. And then most of my books and my writing, often the speaking generates the idea. Sometimes the way I'll say it is, a sermon I'll feel like I get, because those come every 7 days. You feel like you get 75% of the way there, and it's that last 25% of knowing there's something more in that passage, or there's something that connects in deeper ways than I was able to explore in 1 week that gets me excited about digging into it, and then trying to turn that into what might end up being a book-length project or a longer article, something like that.
Gotcha. So give me the kind of inflection point in your life that really led you wanting to shepherd a church and be a pastor.
Well, it wasn't my plan. I thought I was going to go to law school.
How about that?
I was big into speech and debate in high school, and I had some scholarship opportunities. I competed at the national level in speech and debate, and I'll never forget a summer where I just sensed, by the Holy Spirit's leading, that He was asking me to become a pastor and pastor a congregation. And I remember telling my debate coach, I think I'm going to go to this little Bible college that you've never heard of, that barely has accreditation, instead of this larger university you've heard of with this debate scholarship. And even for my parents who were believers, that was a real sort of test of faith. I think everybody was like, why don't you get the law degree as a backup plan and then kind of pursue seminary or something? But, as you do in your teenage years, I was on fire and excited about it, and there was no turning back. And looking back, I'm grateful for it. So I went to Bible college and then on to seminary. Started pastoring, working at a church during that time. And then not long after seminary, started a church that's still the church that I pastor today. And it's a small church, about 100 people. I really like the relational side of ministry. So, I know everyone, and most people have been in my home, and I've been in most of theirs. And I like that context of pastoring. So, it's been, I use the word inevitable sometimes. I think pastoring is a kind of vocation where I've been doing it long enough, and it felt clear enough that it's who I am, that it would be a hard switch to just turn on and off. It is more than just a job. It's a kind of way of living and being. And I think that's true for our whole family as well.
Man, that's great. Wow. So let's kind of get towards the book. And I'm curious, why masculinity? What about your journey connected you to like, man, I want to write a book for men and helping men. And because like I said, the book, the tagline is how to become a better man. So what about your life that really goes, man, I really want to help men become better men?
Today's episode is brought to you by Thrive Marriage Lab. If you want your marriage to thrive, this is a great opportunity to you, because strong marriages are the bedrock of strong churches, organization, families, and community. This is a 12-month pathway for any of you that are looking to really have weekly engagement with experienced marriage counselors, not just one, but many. So go to restory.life/thrive to get on the waiting list for this great program that starts in April. That's restory.life/thrive. And make sure you put the word Forge in the promo code to receive a discount on your monthly fee. Now, back to the episode.
A lot of that flows out of being a pastor. So I've got a congregation of men. I'm a man. I'm raising a son. I grew up with a brother and a father. And I've watched over the last few years as this conversation about what it means to be a man has become not only confusing, but in some cases controversial. It's never been easier as a pastor to build a large women's ministry, to empower women, I go to my Christian bookshop and there's 7 bookcases full of books for women and new books coming out all the time. Yeah. And yet when it comes to conversations about masculinity and manhood, I myself, but also the pastors I know, I feel the vulnerability of those conversations, that you're navigating territory that feels like it's got landmines, that it could be controversial, that you could say the wrong thing. I think a lot of pastors are avoiding it because of that. And I go to the same bookstore, and for the 7 shelves of women's books, there's maybe 1 for men. And it tends to still be anchored by Wild at Heart and Every Man's Battle. And we've not really had, the thing that really struck me too is a lot of the young men in my congregation, they were reading and thinking about these questions. They weren't ignoring them. They just weren't finding anybody within the Christian church that was giving them compelling answers or having the kinds of conversations that they were listening to on podcasts or reading in other books. And so I realized as a pastor, I just needed better tools for talking to the men in my congregation, for helping them figure out how to navigate the cultural controversies around masculinity. And I wouldn't consider myself just a men's author. I mean, I think the books I'll do in the future, they'll probably be wider than just men. But it felt like this was a moment where the church really needs help talking about what is manhood? What is Christian manhood? What does it mean to grow as a man? How does that work relate to the controversies right now around masculinity in our culture? And I hoped that maybe I could just be a helpful voice in helping men navigate those things.
Yeah. And where do you feel like this message is resonating, I guess, in what age group of men? Do you feel like it's gone across? Because, what's interesting about your instincts, and I don't think you intentionally did this, or maybe you did, and maybe you could say, it's each instinct feels like it's a stage of life. But where do you feel like this is resonating mostly?
Yeah, well, I certainly wanted the book to be helpful to men across all ages. And part of the reason for that is I think a really good book, one of the things a great book can do is it gives us language for something that we all felt or experienced but didn't have the tools to talk about. So when a good book comes along and you find yourself reading it and saying, that's the thing, I know that feeling, or I know that experience, and now you have a word or a title that you can use to have that conversation with other men. And I wanted this book to be able to be that. I wanted it to be a tool that allowed fathers to talk to sons, that allowed a father to talk to his older father, that allowed a group of men at a church to come around and gave them the tools across generations to be able to have those conversations. That was really intentional. I wanted it to be a book that would be helpful to facilitate those conversations in a way that sometimes we do get siloed into these age brackets as men, and there's certain good reasons for that. But hopefully we need a way to have conversations that allow us to share that wisdom across those ages, and that's something we struggle with in the church, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something interesting that I feel like this is coming up, because I feel like for thousands of years, men, we had a rite of passage. There was an intentional effort from boyhood to manhood, and the modern man is kind of losing, which is creating a lot of futility, a lot of aimlessness in our 20s and 30s. Just writing this book, is that part of it? Is you're feeling this is a way for a father to be intentional with his son, his teenage boy, to kind of say, hey, be aware of this stepping into your adulthood?
Yeah, I framed the book around the Apostle Paul's advice to the young man Timothy. So there is definitely a father-son dynamic going on there. Paul describes Timothy as his son. He's not physically his son, but spiritually he is. And Timothy's pastoring in a really difficult place in Ephesus, where there's conflict amongst the genders, there's quarrels and controversy spreading, and he's been charged with sort of working through false teaching that's impacting the church. And Paul tells him in his first letter to Timothy that he'll make progress. He's using moral language. You'll become a better pastor and leader of this people when you learn to pay. He gives him two things: pay close attention to your life and close attention to your doctrine, or the teaching, the gospel. And Paul goes on to say that by doing this, you'll save both yourself and your hearers. You'll bear responsibility for yourself, but also those that you're responsible for well. And so I hope that is a tool that allows not just me to do that myself, I pay close attention to myself and pay close attention to what I have through Christ, those two works coming together that lets me make progress. But then that becomes a kind of tool that a father could help lead his son through as well, or that a pastor could lead the men in his church through as well. And, it is interesting. I quote, because I think you've diagnosed it correctly, that there's a sense of disillusionment and aimlessness that's set in for a lot of men. And I think it tracks back to, we've created a culture where there is no right or wrong. There is no good versus evil. There is no moral, natural law. What exists is sort of, what you construct, the self that you choose to express, unless that self is a kind of traditional masculine identity, at which point that is wrong, even though there is no right or wrong. Lewis warned about all this. He described, in Abolition of Man, he described this idea that we laugh at honor, and then we're shocked to find traitors in our midst. We say to men that there is no right or wrong, there's no purpose outside of what you construct, and then we're shocked when they construct right and wrong and purpose that sometimes is horrific, or sometimes just disengaged and disillusioned. And so I think part of the opportunity before the church in this culture is just to say there is truth, that it is a good thing by creation. It is good to be male and female, that to be male is a calling and a responsibility, a purpose and a meaning that can be lived into for something better than just yourself, and that those responsibilities are worth taking up, because nowhere else in culture we don't have the tools or the mechanisms to say that anymore. We've deconstructed all of that value and that truth and meaning. And I think a whole generation of men, there's a great line from Walker Percy's novel, The Moviegoer, which is about a sort of disillusioned man in his 30s. And he says at one point, actually, it's on his 30th birthday, his 30th birthday, he says that men are dead, 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 and the malaise has settled like the fallout. Malaise being the sense of unease, but not sure what's wrong. And he says that the only thing that we feared more than the bomb falling, he's writing during the atomic age, the only thing we feared worse than a nuclear bomb was that the bomb wouldn't fall. And what is there left to do on this, my 30th birthday, but fall prey to desire? I've always been really haunted by that quote, because I think it captures where men are. The only thing that is more terrifying than catastrophe, than war, is that there's nothing, that nothing will ever happen, that there's no meaning or purpose, that life is sort of empty and without aim. That, in some ways, for men is more horrifying than the prospect of actual conflict, of nuclear war. And I think that's what we've handed most men, is a world and a future devoid of meaning, without purpose. And some men are jumping to violence, but far more men are jumping to just disillusionment, to disengagement, and just dropping out.
Yeah. And I think you've hit on this. I want to say, I know you've talked about this in the book, but I've also heard you talk about somewhere other. It's like we swing one way or the other. Like there's the language of men are terrible, toxic masculinity to, we get together as men, we just eat meat and you have to hunt, fish, and be this type of, idealistic masculine figure. And you talk about in the book, just there's a balance to all of this. And I think it's what's interesting about every instinct. But yeah, talk a little bit about that, of just like how we've kind of overswung one way or the other in our culture.
Yeah, well, culture tends to only have attention for external things. So we've robbed men. Again, Lewis called this the cultivation of the chest, that a man is made up of both his head, his ideas, but also his belly, which is his appetites. And what we need is a cultivation, a discipline of the chest that allows us to regulate those two things. But the conversations we're having with men tend to be about external things, not those internal cultivations of character. So on one side of the culture, the conversation with men is the way you're expressing and living masculinity is harmful. This traditional masculinity is toxic, characterized by things like competitiveness and aggression, stoicism. We need to deconstruct masculinity and build a new version. So we have marketing campaigns and social campaigns and sound bites trying to convince men to abandon who they are and build something else. There's been an opposite reaction to that says, no, your raw masculine instincts, unquestioned and unchecked, are your truest self. And what you need is to indulge those raw masculine desires with a kind of wild abandon. And that's how you secure who you are as a man. I think both end up being wrong because they don't actually help a man develop character. They don't help a man become better. They just embrace a kind of external image of who a man is or could be. And the real work before us as men is to say, back to Paul's advice to Timothy, how do I pay closer attention to the instincts, the motives at work within me? And how do I use what I have through the resources of the gospel and faith to mature those things into something better so that I'm not stunted into either whatever is raw masculinity there or whatever is culturally right for the moment, but that there's an actual sense of Christ-likeness beginning to form in who I am that then expresses itself outwardly. I think that's really the path we've robbed men of, and the path we have to offer them again if we expect to see them become better.
Yeah, that's really good. So let's dive into the instincts. Sure. And I would love to just, hear just a little bit about your research and process of why you chose these 5.
Yeah. So I had a few of these sort of in the works. I knew, I knew adventure was something I saw a lot of the young men in my congregation sort of wrestling with. I knew ambition was one. But I came across Shakespeare in one of his plays, As You Like It, has this famous monologue that most people know the opening lines. All the world's a stage, and each of us men and women have our entrance and our exits, and a man in his day plays several parts. And then Shakespeare goes on to describe these stages in a man's life. Shakespeare being one of the great psychological writers, he's trying to capture human nature. And he has 7 stages. The first one is birth. The last one is death. And he characterizes those as we're born into the world dependent on someone else's care, a nurse to care for us. And then at the end, he draws the parallel that we usually leave dependent on someone else's care, losing our vision again, losing our autonomy again. So he's trying to make this sort of circularity argument about we tend to leave the world as we came into it. But in between, he has these 5 stages. That the first being a kind of schoolboy age, the 5th of those being a kind of what we might imagine as retirement years. And really quickly, I recognized myself in these stages. I recognized the men in my congregation fit within these stages. And then pretty quickly, I started to recognize you could see at times of their lives the men in the Bible falling into these stages. And so the book is structured around those 5 Shakespearean ages. And then I pair each one with a single word, an instinct, which is what I think Shakespeare is describing, and then a biblical character from the Old Testament to help you recognize how that instinct is at work in their life, so that by reading it, you begin to recognize it or pick up the patterns for how it might be at work within your own life as well.
Yeah, that's great. So
I can say it too. That might be helpful. The instincts are, the first one ended up being sarcasm, then adventure, ambition, reputation, and apathy. So those are the 5.
Yeah, and so you hit a Bible character with each one. which is interesting. So, I mean, sarcasm was Cain, am I my brother's keeper? I mean, I'm like, I've never read that in a sarcastic tone, but you're like, yeah, that's exactly what he's doing. Mm-hmm. And then adventure with Samson, which is like, it's so true. I never thought about that. Like if I'm as strong as him, I could tear a line. I would just slowly take off in the middle of the woods. Wouldn't even care of my limits. And then Moses about ambition, which was interesting. You brought it back to rest and the Sabbath, the value of that as men. And that's where the Leo Tolstoy, I just am resonating so much of cease work and look around, which I want to get to you about men, about living life in that context. And then David, his reputation, and then apathy was Abraham. I can't remember.
Abraham. Yep.
Abraham. Okay. So what led you to choosing these 5? What about your research and your study that led you to choosing those 5?
Well, I've always loved the Old Testament narratives. One of the challenges, though, of them is we tend to read these Old Testament figures as kind of heroic figures. So how can you be like Abraham? How can you be like David? Some of them don't fit, right? You're like, well, sort of, maybe I could be like Samson, but then take some of the warnings as well. But I think we're reading those incorrectly. I think the way you're supposed to read those characters is, and I write in the book, they're more companions than they are heroes. And one of the things that's interesting about how the Hebrews told stories, there's sort of a literary work called mimesis, Eric Auerbach, who goes through and talks about the different storytelling approaches of culture. And he specifically says about the Hebrew storytellers that they were radically different than like the ancient Greeks, who would build these heroic figures as an ideal for their civilizations to strive after. So be like Hercules, look at the value that he puts, or Hector, look at the value that Hector has on display and live into that. That the Hebrew storytellers don't do that. They use the biblical stories as a way of exposing you, as a way of forcing you to look inside and recognize your own motives, your own broken humanity, that these Hebrews are not heroes. David is not, the goal of David's stories is not to be like David. There's certainly things to emulate, but it's really read David's story and then begin to better understand yourself and your own story and your needs in the same way that you see David's needs. And so that's the way I wanted to use them in the book. I wanted to unpack the Old Testament figures in such a way that they didn't just become ideals you were striving for, but they became companions by which you began to recognize your own struggles. You began to understand your own instincts and motives, and then so by them begin to long and look for the same things they longed and looked for, which was ultimately what God alone can do, what Christ brings us through salvation and the transformation of life that he provides. We're all aiming at Christ's likeness, and so were they. So they're really more companions towards that end than they are, my favorite Bible character is David. I'm going to be like David. Great. Good you resonate with David, but what does David point you on to? That's really the question.
And that is interesting. I want to say the modern Christian has done that poorly. And, in the Moses chapter, I love how you dropped a midrash comment. As someone who's studied a little bit more from Messianic Jews, how they take that approach like you're talking about. Like these are just companions that we can learn from.
Yeah, there's more dialogue, right? So we're in on this dialogue that these characters have kind of initiated versus, no, they're the model, align yourself with them. You actually, when you do that, you misread their stories too, because you try to make them more heroic than the writers intended them to be. And so you miss some of the ambiguity that's often the point. You miss some of you smooth things out and make things comfortable that are intentionally supposed to be uncomfortable for you. Oh. You tend to skip and only read the highlights of their life instead of really sort of settling yourself into some of the valley places with them. And so and unfortunately, if you go to them looking at them as models, you often end up misreading their stories as well.
Yeah. So I really would love just to dive into, I resonated with sarcasm, like my high school, college, early 20 years, adventure was very much a big part of my 20s, even in my early 30s, of going on ski trips, getting outdoors, doing things. And I think there is like there's a wild heart message in that, right? You mentioned Don Eldridge, which is still good. And I think you are hitting, and there is some tension. There is some redeemable. But I would love to get to ambition, because I think there are so many guys that resonate with that we are getting to the place where ambition is becoming abusive. We can even use our calling and language like that to only create destruction, almost like Moses did. like he spoke to God as a peer versus versus being God. And so, yeah, I would love just to hear some of your process of really unpacking Moses' story and getting to Bonhoeffer's quote as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's important, and you raise this point, that all of these instincts are, in my mind, neutral. They're not necessarily positive or negative. These are not the 5 expectations of men. You have to have these 5 instincts if you want to qualify, nor are they the 5 sins. Like, you better purge your life of these things.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly I'm not calling for a generation of ambitionless men. That's not what we need. What I'm trying to say is these are instincts. Lewis uses the definition behavior as if from knowledge. So in other words, these are ways of acting, motivations for acting that often that seem to us logical, that we've decided when really we've never questioned them. We're kind of blind to the way that they're influencing us. So these instincts can lead us towards good things if they're matured and controlled and disciplined. But if unchecked, if they're blindly indulged, they tend to lead towards destruction. And that's what I try to show with the biblical characters. Ambition is certainly one of those. Moses' story, you can kind of break it into 3 parts, 40-year increments. He grows up in Egypt. At the end of that first 40 years, he has a great moment of ambition. He strikes down this Egyptian who was beating the 2 Hebrew slaves. The book of Acts tells us that he believed the Hebrew people would rally behind him and that he would lead them to freedom. It really is action based on a vision, an ambition for the future. And of course, it all falls apart. They end up mocking him. Who made you prince over us? And this great ambition of his life fails. So he flees into the wilderness. 40 years pass, and God shows up at the burning bush and says to him, I want you to go back and lead those people to freedom. That was the very ambition he acted on and had. So you would expect Moses to say, absolutely, I've been waiting 40 years for this, right? But instead he says things like, well, I'm slow of speech, and how will they know you sent me? And can you send someone to help? And then eventually, can you just get someone else to do it? And you wonder, how can this be the same Moses that one minute is willing to strike down an Egyptian to liberate his people, and at the next can't even bring himself to entertain the idea of doing it? But I think that's the lived experience of ambition. Ambition is, I think, right. We think of it as just the energy that moves us towards action, but I think that's only half of the experience. Ambition is we have a vision for something better in the future that we feel the responsibility for creating and carrying out. I can see something, I have an ambition, a vision for the future, and I'm taking on that weight, that responsibility of doing that thing, of achieving that thing. And at times, that vision feels very empowering. It leads us to action. We feel capable and excited. But at other times, that vision can feel more like a curse and a discouragement. When we fail and fall short of it, it actually leaves us feeling less ambition. But it's actually still that vision that we're measuring and defining everything around us by. We're measuring our identity. We're measuring the help of others. We're measuring what God is doing. Everything in our life is obsessively measured against how well we're achieving that thing we've set up as the vision, the success, the fulfillment of our life. And that happens for Moses towards the end of his life. He's been leading the Israelites for 40 years. It's been brutal, and they're constantly complaining. And I imagine it was not how he had envisioned that experience would go. Yeah. And finally, after they're again complaining about water, God calls him to go and speak to the rock, and water would flow out to save the people. And instead, what does Moses do? Well, we all remember he strikes the rock. But he does more than that. He also gathers the people and he begins to chastise them. Listen, you rebels. And as you alluded to, he says, must we provide water from this rock for you? And he strikes it. Well, what has he done? Frustrated by the difficulty of achieving that vision, the people constantly making it difficult, he begins to judge the people, you rebels, by this vision he has. He begins to mistake himself and his own emotions for what God is doing. Must we provide water from this rock for you? Well, who's the we? God's doing it, Moses. You're just the messenger. And ultimately, Moses oftentimes finds himself overwhelmed and discouraged. At one point in the wilderness years, even praying for God to kill him so that he can be done with this people, right? He begins to judge himself. And that's where I come back to Bonhoeffer, as you alluded to. Bonhoeffer says, in what for me was a really striking quote, that God hates visionary dreaming. And he goes on to say that God hates it because it makes the man proud, and he sets himself up as the judge of his brethren, the judge of God, and ultimately the judge of himself. That instead of receiving from God, you put yourself in a position of constantly measuring, judging, defining yourself and everyone else around you against your standard. And in the end, what brings it back to Sabbath, as you alluded to, is God will ask Moses to set down that great ambition of his life. He will not enter the promised land. He will die on Mount Nebo looking out at the landscape of the promised land, but not entering it. And in some ways, it's a test for Moses. In the end, has that ambition become your God? Has your pursuit of that ambition become your faith? Or can you set down that thing, and can you rest in who God is and what God is doing and who God has been? And I think Moses actually gets that right. I think he does that. He's able to set it down without it turning into destruction. But he wrestles from the very beginning to the end with how to keep that good thing, that work God has called him to do, how to keep that in its proper checked place. And I think Sabbath is a really helpful tool for doing that.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I could just resonate personally as well, knowing people that you really, that whole judgment towards God, like if you feel like you've got this ambition and it's not happening, you then go, God, why aren't you doing this? You're the one who gave me this calling, this desire, this passion. Yeah. Why haven't you provided?
Why didn't you make me more talented? Why aren't you answering my prayers? Why aren't you bringing me the right people? Why, like you told me you wanted me to do this, and now you're not giving me what I need to do it.
Yeah. But then on the other side, it's like you should see some people are so ambitious and that they're knocking people down as they're trying to get towards their goal. And it's not relational. It's not communal. It's not what God calls us to. We're putting aside love for our own pursuits. So yeah, to that point, you mentioned rest for ambition. Would you say there is a general, or does each one have like these checks and balances? What does men need to know? How do they engage with this and realize, right, they're not evil, they're neutral. So how do I check myself when in these instincts?
Yeah, great question. That was something I really wanted to make sure I tried to do with the book, was not just leave it philosophical, but say, okay, if I'm resonating reading this chapter, like perhaps this instinct is unchecked in my life, perhaps ambition is sort of out of control in my life. How do I go about actually checking that thing, counterbalancing that thing with what I have through faith, through, remember Paul's advice, know myself, pay close attention to my instincts, and pay close attention to the gospel, what I have through Christ. And so for each of the instincts, I try to pair them with an intentional practice of faith, something that you can do as a way of pushing back, as a way of checking. The philosopher Nietzsche says that an instinct is weakened when we force it to rationalize itself. So when we pay closer attention to the instinct and we force it to answer some questions, we gain a little more control over it instead of it controlling us. So when I write about sarcasm in the first chapter with Cain, I write about humility and meekness, the intentional practice of meekness as a balance to sarcasm. For adventure,
real quick, sorry, I didn't have to interrupt, but because I remember thinking about this in the book, what is the difference between humility and meekness?
Yeah, so I think humility I define as self-suspicion, an ability to pause in a moment and ask the question, is it possible that I'm wrong? And I think meekness is a physical practice of that. Meekness is I have the ability to control my reaction. So if humility allows me to pause my sort of swelling sense of pride in the moment and say, wait a minute, maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe there's some way that I'm wrong here. Meekness is the ability to take a punch, to get hit, and instead of reacting and punching back, as Cain does, murders his brother because his brother was accepted and he wasn't, it allows us to pause the reaction for a moment, which I ultimately think is a sign of masculine strength, the ability to control the reaction. So that's the one for it. For adventure, I talk about a practice of discernment, learning to cultivate eyes to recognize what God is doing in the place you are. With ambition, as we've been talking about, I talk about Sabbath, an intentional practice of Sabbath to check the power of ambition on your life. For reputation, I talk about confession, an act of confession as a way of keeping yourself from living in the divided way that I think reputation often can lead us to. And then in the final one, apathy, I talk about intentional practices of sacrifice to force our faith to be alive and active and not succumb to the apathy that often robs us of it.
Yeah. So yeah, Chase, so I mean, kind of the last thing is really, I wanted to kind of unpack with you. You mentioned this, I want to say in one of the videos on your website, and I think it's so true as someone who's wanting to lead men more intentionally better, is as men, we can be really good at life shoulder to shoulder, meaning doing activities, laughing, playing golf, doing things together, but learning to put into practice the face to face the actually looking around and like you're talking about, actually the humility to analyze some of these things, put aside our pride, and actually have, well, that's reflecting or also in a counseling mentor coach, practice. So yeah, if you would just share with men, how do they actually start really analyzing these things and not look at these 5 instincts from an academic point of view where it's kind of dissing themselves, but actually put them in these things and actually analyze them.
Yeah, well, there's certainly nothing wrong with shoulder to shoulder. It's a good place to start, and I hope men are doing it. I hope you have relationships in your life. Go play golf. Go shoot. I like to shoot some clays, right? Like go do something with some other men. But at some point, find ways. And it doesn't. I don't think the act of confession means I have to constantly walk around telling everyone all my baggage. That I have to sort of just be an open book to everyone. What it does mean is, start with God. I'm willing to open up in my personal relationship with God, my prayers, my devotion. I'm willing to name the things that I see at work within me that are a problem, these instincts that are out of control. I'm willing to confess those things before Him. Then find someone, whether it's a pastor or a close friend, preferably somebody who you respect for their masculine maturity, somebody that you look at and think there's a stability there that I respect and that I want in my life. And perhaps it's through the book. Perhaps it's a group of you read the book together and use it as a tool for these discussions. But find ways to open up about, these are the things that feel often unchecked in my life, and I'm trying to learn how to control them, how to put them in their proper balance. That can be a practical conversation. It doesn't have to just be, let me cry and pour my heart out to you of how I'm broken. It can be as simple as, hey, here's things I'm working on in my life. I'm trying to practice a better Sabbath because I see the way my ambition's out of control. You seem to be a man that does that well. I don't sense that same desperation in you. How have you worked intentionally to combat those things in your life? You can make those practical conversations, but inevitably those will lead to deeper conversations too about learning to recognize motives and instincts, and that's what we're after. Ideally, you have kind of a pastor relationship in your life where you can go to for that kind of authority. Ideally, you have a good peer relationship in your life where you can have that conversation with somebody like you. And ideally, as you're growing and maturing and learning these things, you're then providing that for somebody else as well, too, that you're sort of helping lead people into that. So try to think of it less as there's one person in my life I dump all this on. And there's sort of these different relationships that provide a foundation for me to explore or, when needed, to reach out for that advice in different contexts, different authorities. That's really one of the great values of the church is we have all of those. We have fathers, but we also have brothers, and we also have sons in the body of Christ. So try to build out all those things around you if you can.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's such a valuable thing. But I mean, one is just like for the men out there, like, well, where do I find that? How do I pursue that? How would you encourage some of those men that really like, I think I want that, but how do I go about pursuing that?
Yeah, well, show up at a church, be consistent and faithful. I have this little saying I say to my congregation that one of the greatest spiritual disciplines I know is just showing up. If you think this is going to start by you're going to pull out your phone and find a guy and schedule coffee and pour your heart out, you're probably being a little naive. Like, number one, you're probably not going to do it. And then it's probably going to feel awkward, and that's going to keep you from doing it in the future. But if you're intentional about cultivating relationships, I'm going to put myself in the place every week where not just me, but my kids can start building those healthy relationships. My wife can start building those healthy relationships. I, as a man, can start building those relationships. Well, number one, when you do find yourself in a moment of crisis in your life, those relationships will be there. If you wait until a moment of crisis to start finding them, you may still find somebody that's willing to step in and help, but it's not going to have that trust that's been built up over time, somebody that knows you. So be intentional about cultivating those relationships. And I know that's not a glamorous answer, but it's one I deeply believe. I mean, it's one I've pastored for 10 years in the same small church with the same group of people. Like I said before, I'm there outside of a couple weeks that I may be gone on a vacation. I'm there every single Sunday. That matters so much. And I see that slipping in men's life. And men, the statistics tell us they show up at church less than women. They practice their faith privately less than women. I saw one study that for middle-aged men, obesity is no longer the highest risk. It's now isolation, because it often leads to things like addiction, things like suicide. It's becoming harder and harder to have meaningful friendships. And we all want them, but what that takes is just putting yourself routinely in the place where people are. For me, that's the context of worshiping with a group of people. And then branch out from there. Have people over for dinner, go get lunch after church with people, grab coffee or lunch during the work week with someone, and start building those relationships, because when you need them, that work will have been immensely valuable when that moment comes.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate those practical steps, because we can build this expectation of this is how it should go. And then when it doesn't, we immediately go, well, we write it off versus.
And you've got to be intentional. I mean, look, dude, I want to be at the lake, right? Sunday after church, I'm gone, right? Or the cards are on. I got to be home on the couch watching the Cards game. And that's fine. I'm not saying I do plenty of that. But there are some weeks where, you know what, instead of the lake, we're going to have a couple over, for dinner, just to be intentional about building those relationships. And I'm doing this pastorally. My wife and I had this conversation last night. There's a relatively new couple in our church. And I said, hey, we got to get our calendars together. We got to figure out what night we can have them over for dinner. That takes work. It takes planning. It takes a little extra grocery shopping. But we've tried to be really intentional with our life about building those relationships. And time after time, they've paid off when I needed them. They've been there. And I'm just more and more convinced we're losing it, and it's what we all need. That stability of relationships that we have in the body of Christ is something we have to be intentional about and then willing to use when we need them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Well, Chase, I appreciate you coming on. If anybody wants to find out more about Chase, he has a podcast, the Pastor Writer podcast. But Chase, what's some other resources or places people can find you?
Yeah, well, the 5masculineinstincts.com is kind of where everything is, including you can reach out to me there. So I get those emails through the contact form. I love hearing from readers. So let me know what you think about the book. But there's a ton of resources. As you mentioned, there's the assessment. There's a study guide PDF you could download. There's YouVersion reading plans if you use those for devotionals. There's one for each of the 5 instincts, as well as an intro one, some videos there. So anything I can do to be helpful, just shoot me an email through there. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Well, Chase, thanks for coming on. It was a blast. Like I said, I'm loving your book, and man, I'm really excited just to hear how other men are receiving it. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Men Are Forged podcast. Summer's coming to an end, but I know some of y'all are still getting active. You're still going outside. Man, fall's going to be just perfect. And I've got the active wear for you. For a brand with a mission. It's called the 3 Nails Clothing Company. It's at 3nailsclothing.com, and they've got great shorts, t-shirts, and hats for you to really help you be more active. But also, it's a brand with a mission to spread the kingdom and to share the vision of Christ. So you can go to, like I said, 3nailsclothing.com. But when you check out, make sure you put in the Men Are Forged promo code. That's one word, Men Are Forged, all caps. That is because of this podcast, guys, because you're listening here, you get 10% off by using the Men Are Forged promo code at 3nailsclothing.com. So go check out that, get some great active wear. And I appreciate y'all listening, and I'll see you next time.